You're listening to the Curious About Cannabis Podcast. You have uncertainty around things like pipetting. You have uncertainty around the ways the instrument injects. You have uncertainty around temperature fluctuations that affect things like density of liquids that you're working with, even variation related to sampling, which is really a big one, because if sampling is not performed, well, it kind of depends on what the purpose of the testing is, but if the purpose of the testing is to get some sort of quasi-representative value that's supposed to represent a batch of something, then the sampling error becomes a really big deal.
Yeah, absolutely. And when you're benchmarking something like pesticides or residual solvents or even microbiology contamination, they're generally produced by what's called a spike. Like we're going to add X milligrams of pyrethrin to X grams of marijuana, and so you have this calculated theoretical. There is a known answer.
Yeah.
But when we do PTs for cannabinoids, especially what we call in matrix or actual cannabis that's ground up to be homogeneous and then sent to different labs, there's no true answer. There's not a magic machine that knows those cannabinoids, right? That's an unknown material.
It's not a perfect answer. This is 25% THC, absolutely.
Yeah, that's not known. I mean, the only way to know that would be to measure it, and well, we're all measuring it. So there is not a universal measurement to know that any more than what we do. And in those cases, the actual or presumed accurate answer, it comes out of the study. It's essentially the study mean or thereabouts.
Well, I think that's something that a lot of people don't necessarily realize, is that they're, and this is true for all sorts of analytical testing, that when you're dealing with natural products, even if you get a flower sample, grind it to a pulp where it's a powder, like sand almost, and you test that, you're still going to get some variation, and there's still some like minor amounts of heterogeneity even in that bit. And sometimes people get really worked up, and you and I have both experienced this directly. They get really, really worked up when they expect their cannabis flowers to be some certain potency, and then it comes out different. And sometimes that difference from what they've expected is only a couple clicks, a couple percentage points off of their expectations. But because the way cannabis is being priced is oftentimes indexed on THC or now also CBD, depending on the market, those couple of clicks can really piss some people off. And it's they don't tend to react very well to the fact that we could test this 10 different times and you're going to see some, the numbers dance around kind of a common mean or median point. And so, your flower may come out 20%. If I test it now, if I test again, it may come out 18.5. It may come out 21.5. And that doesn't mean that any of those tests were inaccurate or wrong. It's just there's this variance related to the natural heterogeneity of the natural product that's being tested.
It is, for the most part, variation in the natural product. And again, kind of going back to if you're shopping or looking for labs, this is something a lab should be able to show you too, is that, you've mentioned that there's variation in the injection precision of the instrument, in the pipetting of small volumes by technicians. And that's why we're continuously, performing repeated QC measurements like that of our technicians, of our instruments, because, when you come into the lab and I want to convince you that, you should have a relationship with our laboratory and do work here, my presumption is that just trying to impress you and say I have a fancy degree and fancy instruments is not really going to cut it. What I really want to say is that, we measure our precision, and we know what that is. and we're happy to show you how we measure it,
Mm-hmm.
and give you that. Sometimes it's bad news that if I test your same product over and over again over the course of a week, it probably varies in our lab as much as probably 5 or 6% difference.
Right.
And
that's different than percentage points.
Correct.
I want to make clear to people, because sometimes, especially in this industry, when we talk about percentages, those two ideas get conflated. So you're talking about 5 or 6% total. So if you had, if something was coming out at 200 milligrams per gram, or just make it easy, 100 milligrams per gram, you're saying that it may come out 95 milligrams per gram or 105 milligrams per gram. That's the type of variance you're looking at.
Yeah, absolutely. And then when you take that down to, THC, which is around 20%, that would vary a point or two in either direction. And that's normal precision of our process.
Yeah.
So, there's definitely factors. So that's our, say, 5% that we contribute to error.
Mm-hmm.
And then really like the rest is on back to the homogeneity of the material.
Yeah.
And, laboratories, the ideal sample for a laboratory is a pure granular powder that is completely homogeneous. And every time I test a bit of it, it is exactly the same.
Right.
So any variance I get in the data is the sum of variance in, again, measurement, pipetting, injection. But, cannabis is not that. It's, if we're talking about cannabis flower, it's sold as a flower. Like if you test 100 milligram bit that you cut out of the stem versus 100 milligram bit you cut out of the calyx, those are going to have vastly different THC. And a laboratory, their goal or their charge, I guess, sometimes by law, is that, they need to test material as it's sold.
Right.
Right. So there's been much debate and discussion about, the lab should trim the bud. And I get that that's a part of rolling a joint, but, to the laboratory, it's cannabis, but it's produce.
Yeah.
Right. And it's produce in bulk. So it's, it would be misrepresentative for the lab to trim out like
all the extra leaf
and just make this really pristine sample. And I understand that sort of maybe what happens when people prepare the material for bong hits or smoking, but it's a commodity. It's a commodity produce, and we're required to basically test the material as given. That's how it goes to market.